sounded pretty nice, actually. I appreciate that.
It does. It's
Thank
wonderful.
you. I want to just acknowledge there's a couple folks from my team, from the XX Edge team, who are also on the call. If you don't recognize them, Lisa Witter, Ashley Bernardi, and Jennifer Brooker, who are we're all working together on this new, well, it's a book, but it's really a new movement. And before I get into the actual content of telling you more about the book, I just wanted to give you a little bit more of my background. Besides having grown up in Philadelphia, my career in medicine, in addition to being a clinician, I also had the opportunity to have many different executive roles, as Carol mentioned. And in many ways, I had the opportunity to work as a systems engineer in one of the most complex systems there is, which is healthcare and human biology. And my last job at the Care Management Institute at the national offices at Kaiser, I oversaw all of the population care and evidence-based medicine programs. I like to call myself the queen of evidence-based medicine, not only because Kaiser Permanente is a huge enterprise taking care of 10 million members, but also because that's where the expression evidence-based medicine was coined. And when I left my work in healthcare and started the foundation, Tara Health Foundation, and really threw my weight behind the field of impact investing, I was determined to bring everything that I had learned in my healthcare career in terms of complex systems and outcomes and performance improvement, and certainly using evidence to drive change. I was determined to bring all of that to the field of philanthropy and impact investing. So here I am. I also wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of why I wrote this book. And I certainly have never been a writer. I was a chemistry major, and the longest paper I ever wrote during my academic career and was probably about 15 pages. I certainly edited my daughter's term papers and senior theses, but really I had never taken on an enterprise like this. But as you'll see when I tell you a little bit more about the book, it was very relevant to my career in medicine, and the fact that I had, as an obstetrician gynecologist, I worked with women, and I understood how central women are to not only their own healthcare and their families and their communities, but also as consumers and as decision makers in a healthcare system that I was very fortunate at Kaiser Permanente as an extremely diverse workforce, and really understanding women's leadership skills in that way. I'll tell you a little bit more about the book, and you'll understand, I think, better. All right, so I am sharing my slides, right? Everybody see that all right? Mm-hmm. And I think we're a small enough group that, Carol, if it's okay with you, that we can take questions as we go. And my intention is to talk for maybe about 20 minutes or closer to half an hour, and then breakouts or not, depending on how many are in the group. And then we'll come back for some more discussion afterwards. Does that sound right with everybody? So in my background as a philanthropist, when we started the Tara Health Foundation, we were determined to make 100% of the assets of the foundation mission aligned. And our interest in women and girls was particularly focused on reproductive health, given my background. And what this meant that across public equity, mutual funds, private investing, the loans that we gave out, that they all had an alignment with our mission. And when we set out to do that, we found that there were actually very few products out there that would help us in that we actually ended up having to create some of our own products. And the other organization that Carol mentioned, Ria Ventures, was actually created as a private equity venture capital enterprise to bring more capital to the field of reproductive health. So as we were working for the past 10 years, we were building product, building the field, building the evidence. And along the way, I met my partner, my co-author, Patience Maramé Ball, about 3 years ago. And her background was very different from mine. She had her career at the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, and had spent her career in finance and with very creative vehicles to often helping women or engaging women in some of the solutions to the problems that they were addressing around the world. And we really brought together extremely different backgrounds in writing this book. And we started on this enterprise, had the notion of writing the book about a little over a year ago, but really leaned into it last spring. And our intention was to look across all asset classes and to understand the performance of gender diversity. And when women are members of financial leadership teams, what can we expect from outcomes? And we had seen pieces of, there had been lots of talk, for instance, about the impact of having women on boards. And we certainly were starting to see the effect of women as founders of early stage seed companies when we were investing as seed funders. Everyone knows that women are more reliable in paying back their debts, right? So it was like this, we had these little clues, these breadcrumbs were being laid, and we leaned into trying to understand across all asset classes. And I also knew from my personal experience in investing our portfolio at Tara Health Foundation, as I said, we were 100% mission aligned, that when we did that, we actually were outperforming the market. And so it wasn't as if we were having to make any kind of concessions. And Patience also had that experience in her own portfolio and the work she was doing. So we had lots of good reasons to think that we were going to find that gender diversity was extremely powerful. So our theory of change when we put this book together was that what we certainly found in our research is that when women are involved in financial decision making, when they're members of the team, that across all capital markets and across all asset classes, that it leads to higher returns, both for the individual investors and for the enterprises investing, and also for greater economic growth. And so what we call a true win-win for all. And when we found this kind of consistency across all asset classes, we were starting to look for patterns and why would this be so? And I think that, and I really want to thank Carol for so much of her brainstorming in the early stages of writing this book, that we were looking for patterns in both in inherent gender differences that were showing up, but also in the context of how women show up to leadership that would help us explain this consistent performance. And it played out over and over again that women were more likely to be more collaborative, had a different approach to risk. They weren't necessarily risk averse, but were analyzed risk differently, more risk aware. And women seem to be more interested in the long-term outcomes and less willing to sacrifice for short-term gains. And we looked to other industries to kind of support some of these findings in terms of inherent differences. And for instance, in the gambling literature, we found that, and I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anybody, that men are more likely to gamble impulsively and more likely to be influenced by social pressures to gamble. It doesn't mean that all men are that way, and it doesn't mean that there aren't any women who are that way. But in terms of a bell-shaped curve and inherent, trends and traits, that this does play out in other industries and in other characteristics. And contextually, that we found that across, whether it's as CEOs or board representation or as founders or fund managers, that if you're only taking the top 5% of any type of talent, that you're missing out on 45% of better than average talent. So there's this general underutilization. So in terms of the context of women's leadership, you're certainly going to see the cream of the crop if you're only using the best of the best, but that there's this opportunity to expand that pool to even bigger. We also, and this is this notion of proximity to problems. This is something that is very robustly analyzed in healthcare. In my experience as a healthcare executive, we learned a long time ago the importance of bringing the people who are closest to the actual healthcare. So whether it's the workers, the frontline workers, or the actual patients who are experiencing a system, that if you bring them to the leadership table and ask them to help you solve the problems, that you're going to get more sustainable solutions that are usually more efficient and more cost effective. So when you're looking at financial markets and the type of, whether it's a new startup company that's addressing the care economy, or a big public company that needs to address its supply chain and climate change and the impact on it's having with food insecurity in their countries where they're manufacturing their goods, that if you actually talk to the people who are closest to the problems you're trying to solve and give them an innovative role, that you're going to get better solutions. And this was something that really played out consistently in our research for the book. And then I just want to emphasize that in our analysis, we were looking at gender diverse teams versus male only teams. So this was not men versus women. This was the power of diversity. And that, that, as I said before, these are traits. These aren't absolutes in terms of behavior from men versus women. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about my relationship with patients. And I said before how different our backgrounds are. And when we came together to write this book, it was with this, we had had an experience. We were in Singapore teaching a workshop, and we had been invited by I love to call her a very fancy banker, to do a presentation to her network and her very fancy bank. For any of you who've been to Singapore, you know that there's a lot of money in banking. And we were in this beautiful boardroom overlooking the harbor and beautiful catered breakfast, and maybe about 30 people. And all the women were lined up on one side of the room and all the men were on the other side. And as soon as we started talking about gender lens investing and some of the inherent barriers to bringing more women into finance, the women in the room were completely engaged. They really understood it. They either had their own personal stories around how hard it was to get financing, or why was there a double standard around the due diligence that was necessary for investors to come into their fund, or how hard it was as an entrepreneur to get the type of backing they need. And so it was a really robust conversation, and the men were all completely quiet. And it was striking to us how the men in the room didn't understand that what they were missing, that this opportunity for gender analysis was totally, they didn't really get it. And they were very happy to eat their breakfasts, however. So that was really when, as partners, we realized that we needed to write a book. And in our discovery and our research, we were really delighted to find that across all asset classes, if there is any research, it's very clear that gender diversity wins. And certainly there are gaps in the research, and there are places where better understanding of these patterns would be extremely helpful to investors. But it was very consistent. We did not have to cherry pick. We also were really moved by all of the dislocations and disruptions that are going on in the world, and how this opportunity to invest differently, to include diverse teams, is a really powerful solution to some of the most pressing problems, whether it's food insecurity and climate change, or poverty, violence, the care economy, healthcare. That across the board, there are opportunities for new strategies. And that this opportunity is so powerful that it's actually a material risk to enterprises to not include a gender analysis. And in the book, we talk quite a bit about what some of those risks are. So just to give you a few data points, and they're quite a few more of them in the book, and curious to know if any of this is surprising to all of you, that some of the analysis, when you look at teams that are defined as being gender inclusive, and in this particular study, it meant that they were the top quartile of gender diverse teams, that they were 21% more likely to have outperformance in terms of profitability. Another study that looked at when new CFOs came into large companies, and you compared their performance to their male predecessors, there was a 6% increase in profits and an 8% bump in stock performance. New companies with female founders performed 63% better than those with all male teams. And this was over a 10-year period. Women-run hedge funds, which we don't normally think of as being it's certainly not a women-dominated field. I think that the number of women hedge fund leaders is certainly less than 3%. But the ones that are out there are outperforming. And this may, once again, be an example of where if you have so few that you're missing out on quite a bit of talent. But in looking at women-run hedge funds, they outperformed even larger funds by a margin of 6%. And then this is something that was really interesting, that traditionally women historically have always been offered, have often been offered higher interest rates and have been considered a higher risk from lenders. And yet, whether you're looking at mortgages or small and medium-sized businesses, whether it's in the United States or in the developing world, that women consistently were more reliable debt repayers and had significantly lower non-performing loan ratios. And interestingly, too, that they tended to have more loyalty to their banks. Was an interesting study that was done in Chile where they looked at their, compared their women and male borrowers, and we're also able to surface the fact that the bankers who wrote these loans were biased towards the women, and they actually found that the cost of preferentially giving loans to men would actually have paid for all of their salaries. So this bias, that historical bias in terms of lending, is actually eroding profits from the banks that are providing these loans. One other thing I want to stress, and this also came up in our research, is that we're not talking about a zero-sum game. That when you add, it's not a question of switching out men for women. It's really about bringing more women, more diversity to the table, making the table bigger. That it actually ends up growing the economic pie. It's not a replacement strategy. It's an inclusion strategy. So, I don't have a good sense of everyone in the room and their experience, and I actually was thinking it would be helpful if you put your what you do in your in the chat. Would be very helpful to me, along with your what kind of organization you work for. But what does a gender analysis look like? Certainly people know that there's been a lot of talk about a number of women on boards, or screening your investments for the leadership team and how many women are in the C-suite, or looking, when you're making investments, looking at the fund managers. Are there women on the general, GPs in the funds you're invested in? If you are providing capital to investments yourself, whether as a fund or personally, or if you're on an investment committee for some large endowment, who are the entrepreneurs that you're funding? Are they? Is there a gender diversity in your who you're backing? So those are pretty classic things that I think anyone can check a box. And there's even some countries and some states, although California's law that mandated number of women on boards of public companies was just overturned. But there certainly are some movement towards disclosure of women as board directors. But there are other ways to think about a gender analysis too. That looking, and this also was something that we found in our research, that if you have treasury bonds or government bonds, what countries are you investing in? And there was definitely a correlation between the access to legal rights and reproductive health, for instance, or how restrictive the laws were around driving or land ownership, that the countries that scored the best on on women's equality actually were a much more reliable investment opportunities. And it's not just whether you're investing in the country itself, but if you're investing in enterprises that are doing business in those countries. So this is another way to think about screening for gender. And certainly in the United States now, with what's happening to reproductive health access, there's no question that the lack of access to quality healthcare for a workforce is a huge material risk to enterprises that have their locations in those states. And through our work at Tara Health, we've actually looked at the direct financial impact, both at the enterprise level and at the state level, when women won't have access to abortion care. It increases their, given the prevalence of unintended pregnancies and the demand for these services, women aren't going to not seek care. They're going to have to take longer off work, or they're going to have to travel, raise more money in order to be able to get access. Or if they do choose to keep a pregnancy that they otherwise wouldn't, obviously that has an impact on your workforce too. So the business costs to restrictive laws, whether at the state level in the United States or at the country level around the world, is something that you should consider when you're looking at your investment strategy. And then this is something that we also talk about quite a bit in the book, that if you're investing in companies that are not designing their products or services for half the population, that's something that you should really take into account too. And there's certainly been lots of stories of misadventures when that hasn't been the case. And probably one that maybe you've all heard about is with airbags. When the work was being done in the 70s to understand the impact of car crashes on passengers, the model for to design the the safety system were male prototype crash test dummies. And as a result, the differences between men and women's anatomy was totally overlooked. And the impact of airbags, for instance, on passengers, for smaller people, the lack of understanding of what happens to pregnant women when they have a seatbelt on, all of these things were just neglected. And not only were lives lost because of it, but it also cost the car companies quite a bit of money when they had to rework their safety systems. And so that's just one dramatic example, but there are certainly many cases where products and services are being designed where there aren't women at the innovation table, or they're just not being, the designs are not being considered in terms of the impact on women. So in writing this book, what did we want to have happen? And my daughter, in her wisdom, is like, Mom, what do you want people to do about this book? You can write this book, but what action do you want to have change? And being a young entrepreneur herself, she's all in. And what we think is that there's really an opportunity for behavior change. And in thinking about this book and that story in Singapore with the men on the side eating their breakfast with their heads down and having no idea what we were talking about, we really are targeting men in the finance industry. And not necessarily because we all don't have an opportunity to change our behavior, but because we think that that's the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that if we're able to reach men and help them understand that a gender analysis is actually going to enhance their investments. And this isn't just for investment professionals. And I know that many of you are, but some of you probably aren't investment professionals, but we're all investment professionals. We all have 401ks. We all make investment decisions every day, certainly in even how we access our consumer goods and what kinds of companies we decide to shop at. That if we understand the power of including women in the financial markets at all levels of the markets, and who we hire, if we're even if we're in a consumer goods company or some of it, there's always opportunity for us to be more inclusive. So that's our short-term goal, and our long-term goal is that currently in the world that more than 97% of capital is allocated by men. 97%. So even though the numbers of women in finance is much higher than 3%, it's that their assets under management are so much smaller. So, and what it really comes down to is capital. So if we can make some inroads into that number, and even if we just get to 30%, we really think it's going to make an impact on the world, on the economy, on the solutions to the problems that we're addressing as a species. And ultimately, what we want is that gender analysis is an essential mainstream financial strategy, that it's taught at Wharton, and that it's not something that feels in any way out of the mainstream or concessionary, that it's really just the way that any good financial analyst is going to utilize a gender analysis. So that's what I had wanted to talk about in terms of the book, and then we were going to break out into smaller discussions, and certainly I'm available for any questions before we do that. Now I'm finally getting a chance to look at the chat and see where everybody's from.
Ruth, I have a question for you. In the gender diverse teams, I was wondering, what did that mix look like? Like, was in terms of social emotional intelligence. So if you had a diverse team, was it the women and everyone else who was in that team, did they have, thinking of it as the bell curve, right? Like, were they in the middle of the bell curve for social emotional intelligence? Were they off the charts on social emotional intelligence, or was that not a factor at all?
You know, Carol will probably be a better source of that research, and we didn't necessarily look at the outcomes in that specific regard. I mean, we really were targeting diversity and financial performance as the metrics. But one thing just to say to that is that we know from all kinds of diversity literature, not just with gender, that you need more than just one person on that team in order to optimize their contributions. And the magic number seems to be 30% or 3. And in order for those individuals to have any kind of collective voice. But I don't know, Carol, do you have any answer to Kelly's question?
You're on mute.
I was trying to find the button, sorry. No, Ruth, absolutely. I think it would be an interesting study. I mean, I've been thinking for the last, ever since I ordered this book and have now received it, I've been just thinking about what else one could look into around this, because I think probably the next step after getting to 30%, or as we go in that direction, is to figure out it's not just by virtue of gender that this is happening. It's a set of characteristics, right, that people have. And so how do you illuminate those so that it's not just women, but it's men and women, but it's a particular set of characteristics that are critical for getting this kind of profitability and success.
Thank you. And I was remiss in saying fabulous presentation. This is really fascinating, Ruth. So thank you for sharing it with us.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Are you finding that when you make these presentations to mixed audiences, that the women are saying, yes, 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 it's so true. And the men are saying, you're stepping on our territory, we're feeling threatened, we don't buy it. It's just a bunch of women getting together, kind of trying to make themselves look better and be all in all. So are you finding lots of resistance or any resistance?
Well, is it like Singapore all over again? Well, in general, it's not that I haven't ever heard any men, whether they're personal relations or in these sorts of forums, say that it's wrong. They just don't say anything. So I assume, I'm looking at you guys, I'd love to hear your reactions to these theories. And I certainly have quite a few men in my circles professionally who really have drunk the Kool-Aid. And it's not, I mean, that expression implies that it's somehow, not real. And it is real. And so I have quite a few men in my network who do understand this power. But for those, I also have men in my networks, really close family friend who is a middle manager at a investment shop, not a big one, average size. So he's like the prototype target audience. White guy, he's probably 58, and great career, but not super successful, but solid. And he's been a great source for me in it's a one-person focus group. What do you think of this cover? What do you think of this title? And he's been incredibly supportive and all along. And then the book's finally done, and I say, I won't tell you his name, but I say, hey, what do you think? Is it going to change your practice? Because right? I mean, that's what it's all about. He said, no. I'm like, why? You were there all along. You get it. And he's like, well, there's no products and my customers aren't asking for it. So why should I change? And I mean, that therein is the essence of changing any system, right? If you're a grocery store and some guy, some gal shows up with their truck with organic food and says, hey, can we put it in your store? And they say, no one, you're here, but then I won't have any product and my customers aren't asking for it. So how do you actually change behavior? You have customers, and you're all customers of investment decisions, and you need product. So the big banks and the mainstream banks need to recognize this power. And then the guys like my friend are going to say, oh, I have to do this. Oh, and look, here's this book that says that it's actually a winning strategy. So I think that it has to be a perfect storm, that the influence has to come from all directions. But that being said, I would love to hear any of the gentlemen in our group today, if this is all news, if it seems, are you curious, or it's like, oh yeah, I know this already.
To me, it was a kind of good hidden secret in my career in the government, because trying to hire good people in the government is a difficult thing. There's a lot of mediocre people there that are just kind of riding along. Trying to find the people that are going to stand out and be good is difficult when you're hiring. And I always found that I would look for the women that are coming back into the workforce after having been gone, that were actually trained and educated at levels that would make them 3 or 4 grades higher than what I was hiring for, and they were applying for that job because it's all they could get. And I would bring them in and then mentor them and give them opportunities for training and accelerated career development, and they would rise quickly to the top. But meanwhile, in my lower graded jobs, I had people that were far overqualified for the jobs, and the organization performed much better than it had before, or that other organizations it was competing with. So I always found it a rich, the fact that the women out there in the marketplace in the area I was working in finance, and I was working in project management and supply chain. The women out there were all kind of suppressed. They were all overeducated and underachieving. And so I always kind of had a bias towards hiring women, because I found I would get much better performance out of the women I hired, because they were overqualified and they would quickly rise to the top. Many of the women I brought on board that way are now executives in the Department of Defense. So it was, I found it a very win-win situation to recognize the fact that there's this, it's not all women, but it's a group of women out there that are underachieving. They're overeducated and underperforming because they've been held back. And if you can tap into that, you can really it's really a resource that you can take advantage of.
Yeah, I found some of the statistics that you quoted, almost a little bit depressing, insofar as, I'd almost envisaged that we were further along the road than we are. I spent a fair amount of time working in Europe, and it is my sense that as a generalization, Europe is a bit further ahead in terms of women in the workplace. And they certainly have a probably better approach to maternity leave, paternity leave, healthcare, etc. in many instances. So I wonder whether I sort of struggle to, it's difficult to know how you sort of unlock it. There's clearly incredible amount of potential. But what are the sort of levers to unlock it? And I wonder whether there may be some lessons from other countries who are, as I say, further along the road that you can sort of learn to, to try and sort of, introduce into the US, really.
Yeah.
I found that at NATO, when I was working at NATO, I was hiring people. My administrative assistant had 2 master's degrees and she spoke 6 languages and she was fantastic. And so they're ahead of us in some ways, but in other ways, it's just, they have the same suppression that's out there. But I think the key is to take the statistics that you have, which are valid in the book, and somehow add to that the power of tapping into this untapped market.
That's right.
And so you get the managers to, if the managers look at the statistics and they'll do like your friend did and say, well, it's not changing anything. There's no demand for it, but there is demand for him to perform better. And so if the message comes out, if you take the book with the statistics and then you add the message that, hey, this is how you can perform better and you can sell that, I think that's where you tip the scale. And then they start looking at, oh, I can actually do better if I do go this way, right?
Well, I think even in selecting our title, the XX Edge, I mean, we really do see it as a way of getting ahead. This is an edge that you can have in your business whether you're making investment decisions professionally or you're running a company or whatever. So that is our intention, and we do see it that way, that there's this underutilized talent, just like you said, Tim, that can be tapped into. And Andy, for your comment about are there other models in other countries, and this is something that we do talk about in the book, that certainly there are some, like Norway, I think is one of the classic examples where they've really brought a lot of this to bear in how they've re-engineered the care economy, for instance. And certainly in Europe, there are much more favorable benefits that the government provides that and don't just help women, but help everybody. And I think that's also one of the themes in the book, is that if you make the workplace more hospitable, more friendly for women, that you're going to benefit everybody, that it's not just women who benefit from having more robust healthcare or better parental leave benefits. But there's, in terms of the examples from around the world, they're not just in Europe. There are a lot of there are a lot of sort of smaller studies around like urban development in developing countries where they've or violence alleviation. There's some great stories about how community was, the girls were all being attacked on their way home from work. They're working in a factory. And so they gave the girls the opportunity to address the gender violence in their community. And they mapped out this, like they developed an app where you could look on your phone and see where the most violent areas were and address them as a community rather than, so there's a lot of innovation that can happen around the world that we can all learn from. So yes, the short answer is yes, there's a lot of great models, but they're not just all coming from rich countries.
So I'll make a comment regarding the investing world. I work at Merrill investment company. So there is a trend in the investing community toward companies that are focused on what we call ESG, or environmental, social, and governance factors. So we actually put portfolios together that screen companies on these different metrics. And one of those metrics does include what percent of the board members are female or diverse. So I think your public companies are in sync with your premise here that the research that Merrill does actually does show that these companies have better bottom lines when they're more diverse in terms of their board, in terms of their C-level management. But the challenge I see, even at my level, in terms of the team I work with, is bringing women into this type of business, into finance. in my team, I work with 3 other individuals. We're trying to add another female. I can't find another female advisor to join. So it's again, I think it kind of goes back to, middle school, high school, getting females more focused in terms of the opportunity set, because we do very well in this type of business, because I think we're more relationship. We're able to develop deeper relationships with people, I think, from a client perspective. I don't know, just again, I don't want to offend anybody around the table, but I just think that, it's a type of business that is very opportunistic for a female. And if you know anybody out there who is interested in being in this type of business, I am looking for someone for our team, just as an aside.
And there is, Helen, you bring up, we in writing this book, we want to make it clear that we're not trying to offend anybody, that, and very grateful for the talents and skills and leadership that men have provided for the past couple thousand years. So it really is about diversity, and we can all benefit from bringing people with very different backgrounds to our teams. And it is a pipeline problem. I don't mean to say, oh, there's plenty of women out there. There are a lot of women out there, but it's going to take time, and demand does tend to drive supply. So as these roles, whether it's in finance or in other industries, become more inclusive and there's more opportunity, then obviously it's going to make it more attractive for women or other folks to go into these fields. So it's not something you can't just snap your fingers and expect a change in these industries.
Yeah, and if I can go back to what Lori had mentioned, when you think about, as a guy, but guy is like, no, I'm not going to work with a woman or a minority, whatever it is. To me, that's a guy who's insecure. He's got insecurities. He's got an ego for whatever reason that's getting in his way, and it's preventing him from understanding different viewpoints and seeing things a different way. That's his problem. That's something that he's got to overcome and he's got to work with. I worked with Helen at Merrill Lynch years ago, and she's absolutely fascinating. I would hire her in a heartbeat on my team. She's spot on in terms of women, usually, especially in market times like we have now with the volatility, women traditionally have been more compassionate with clients and have a better way of connecting with the female clients. I've got clients calling me now. I'm a wealth advisor at Truist, and I've got clients calling me, and primarily men, what's going on with the markets? Do I need to make any changes? I'm really concerned about this. I'm really concerned about that. Whereas the women, when I call and talk to them, they're like, no, we're good. We're staying the course. We're going to, we understand the strategy works. You did the financial plan for us. I understand that. The men just, they're more aggressive, but they also seem to panic a lot faster than the women do. So, I definitely see the compassion side and a more thorough understanding. And if I meet a gentleman for the first time and he's married, I will mandate that she's at the next meeting. I absolutely will not do business unless I meet his wife. I want to understand what's going on there. And if, God forbid, something happens to him, I don't want her left in the dark. I want her knowing exactly what's going on, and I want her included in these conversations. So, again,
Kevin, you're like a one-person focus group. That's like, you said it all. So that there's this fascinating literature about consumer behavior and consumer loyalty, particularly for women. And there's so many studies about how women, when their husband dies, that like 75% of them go out and find a new financial manager, planner. So you're spot on that if you don't develop a relationship with the wife and woman and make sure that her needs are being met, that's not going to be a sticky relationship if something happens to her husband. And that's great. And you're out. Yeah. So you've definitely drunk the Kool-Aid. Yeah, and any other reactions? Anyone else? And I have a little bit more in terms of a call to action, and can go over that too.
I don't have any, this is Alex Pena. I don't have any knowledge to add to the conversation, except I'm very impressed. I'm part of a media organization for women, and we also do that in the media industry, in the television industry, that we look for men that are pro-women and to collaborate, because it's not the language of like a boys club. It's about how can we work together? How can we learn from each other? We both bring different things to the table. And that's one of the missions that we have, that as executive women in the media industry, that we look back and make sure that we're making room for someone else at the table, because that's how we grow. Right. So I'm completely new. I want to be an accredited investor. So I'm trying to just soak up and learn as much as I can in the short period of time before I join an investment club, or, just I'm listening, and this is extremely impressive conversations.
And Alex, it's Alex or Alexandra? Alex, okay. I love that you're learning. And, one thing, and also I would love to get Carol's take on this too. In my career, as the relatively senior in my career, it was always assumed that to get ahead, that you had to behave more like a man, right? That the folks who were the most successful, whether as government leaders or in my industry in healthcare, or in that they were successful because they could channel male traits and win that way. But what I've learned from this book, and certainly want to share it with folks who are more junior in their career, is that women and people with all different types of diverse backgrounds and lived experiences, the power of showing up with those experiences is probably more important than channeling whatever male traits you think you could. And that to have the confidence that what you bring to the table because of those experiences, not in spite of those experiences, is essential to your leadership. And that if this book can somehow change minds and hearts, that is not only okay, but that there's huge power in that. I think is really, really important. So bravo, Alex, good for you. I'm just going to bring up.
I was just going to say, I think the world is really evolving that direction. I think the idea that you have to adhere to a certain style, a sort of traditional male style, was probably true when I started in the workforce, or at least there were certain degrees of truth in it. It's a much, much less true today. And looking at, I've got two kids who are basically college age, looking at their generation, they love interacting with people who are different from themselves, at least a lot more than we were comfortable doing when I was growing up. So I think your point is really important and aligned with the way the world is going.
I'm gonna jump to this last slide. I think that's a great transition, David. If I can get, okay, so what do we want you to do? And what's the behavior change, and how do you do it? Certainly investing through women, and what that means is to screen your investments, whether you're working with a professional and you ask them to do it, or you do it yourself, to look at where women show up in the leadership of the enterprises that you're investing in, whether it's a fund, public company, private company, or even where you grocery shop, where are women in the leadership of those enterprises? And then hiring women, and this is something that I think a lot of the discussion touched on, and particularly that how can you recruit women to come work for you, especially if there's a relatively small pool. In these times, I know that there's concern that many women have left the workforce. You have to make what you're hiring them for attractive. And that means offering great benefits. It means looking to see where you're hiring. Are you in a state or a country that has restrictive laws where women aren't going to want to live? Show up in a way as a hiring manager that you understand what they're bringing and value their diversity. And just saying, well, there aren't any women out there is not sufficient. You have to actually, it has to be intentional, and you have to really work at it. And then something else that I wanted that we haven't touched on so much is the power of mentoring. And as a mentor in my own career, I would say 95% of the people I've mentored are white young women who look pretty much just like me. So it's not just men who are guilty of this. We all do it, that we tend to mentor people who look just like ourselves. And you have to be intentional to reach across the demographics to find people who don't look just like you. And that the power of mentorship, certainly within the workforce, it doesn't just mean you have coffee once a month. It means actively supporting people. It means if you work for a huge company and you're mentoring somebody, you acknowledge that that's the nature of your relationship. You endorse them in ways, whether it's publicly by acknowledging what great work they're doing, or privately by pointing out opportunities for them to advance. And then promoting women. This was touched on a bit too. I think that women tend to be less aggressive in seeking promotions, and it's possible that it's changing with our current with the generation of workers, but certainly in my day and my peers, women tend to wait till they are sure that they have the qualifications for a new job. And men tend to, once again, there's no absolutes, men tend to be more willing to learn on the job. So if you're a manager and you want to bring women into leadership, higher leadership posts in your organization, you have to go look for them. You have to tap them and say, do you realize that we're recruiting for this job, and maybe you would be a good person for it. So it takes a strategy, and it takes intention to do that. And then the designing for women, this is something that obviously with the airbag story, but wherever, or if you're a financial, if you're an investment advisor, you have to make sure that your products are ones that are going to meet the needs of female consumers. And that doesn't just mean thinking about it yourself. If you're a man, you're not capable of knowing for sure what women want. You need to actually talk to women in order to design products for them. And you can certainly do that on the job. It's not like you have to convene a focus group, but you have to actually reach out and understand the markets in order to design for women. And that means that if you're investing in a company and you think that their products are not being designed for women, that you should think about that. And you should also make sure that they have women on their design team who are influencing the development of their products. Voting for women. And this is not necessarily just at the exclusion of men, but you vote in local government and certainly state and national government, but also as shareholders, we vote, and voting your proxy in companies that you own stock in. And then this one is also important, and we touched on it with the notion of you need more than one. Listening to women means that you have to actually make room at the table for them to be heard. And having more than one does help. If you are recruiting a team, that just having one person who represents a demographic of any type is not going to really optimize how you can learn from that person. And it means actually stopping to talk so that you can listen. And it's fascinating. And I know, Carol, your research has shown a lot of this too, that in terms of how people contribute in the workforce is different for men and women. And then lastly, tell your friends, buy our book. All the proceeds from the book go to benefit patients and my nonprofits. But we do think that these messages in the book are really important. And ultimately, we want to drive a movement. And we see the book as a tool to influence really changing the face of finance to being one of more diverse, and certainly including more women. And spreading the word, both professionally and personally, we think is really powerful, that the opportunity to influence and change culture and change behavior is really in all of our hands. You know, the book hopefully will help, but it's really up to us to actually make a difference.
Ruth, this is Barbara. I think your calls to action are great because I have a little bit of pessimism in me, although I'm very, very hopeful. So I think about a book that was written, oh God, many years ago called Backlash. And if any of you are familiar with it, it basically shows that as women through history, it was a historical research looking that as women got to more equality with men, that there was a backlash and it pushed them back. I'm concerned with not only here in the United States, but around the world, that there might be some backlash. I think we're at a pivotal point here in the United States for so many things, obviously, as well as around the world, of the progress that women have made. I think it's tenuous. I don't think we can take it for granted. And I think that it's really important that we as women and men as well, for sure, we're not silent, that we don't allow some things to happen that could happen, and that we do these call to action. So I think that they are right on, and I think we have to be heard.
You're absolutely right.
Also, in addition to the fabulous leadership lens, what I'm taking away from this also is my responsibility as a consumer to ask for things. And your example of the grocery store really struck me because I realize we do really have a responsibility in asking for the things that we want and demonstrating that demand. And then the one example was we did work with an advisor who was a small firm, and I asked for a heavily weighted ESG portfolio and they didn't have one. So they made one for me. And then were pleasantly surprised to find out that it performed on par with everything else, which is, of course, what I had believed. And even if it hadn't, because I have a long view, because I am more risk aware, and I had read the longitudinal studies that said, you know, companies that do well by doing good do well in good economic times and bad. So I wasn't surprised by it, but they were. And then that was something that they were going to then offer to others. So the one voice can sometimes, you know, have an amplified effect. But you helped me understand I should probably be doing that in other areas.
That's a great story, Kelly, and it certainly mirrors my experience in putting together my own portfolio. I at Tara Health, we had this outrageous idea that we should be all of our assets should be aligned with women and girls. And I had two fund manage, investment advisors at Merrill Lynch, two women who were like, okay, we'll try this out. And lo and behold, we're their strongest performing portfolio. And I mean, and they do pretty good anyway. So I think that's what we're all seeing. And that is exactly the story of the book, that, hey, look at this, isn't this great? But we have to demand it as my male friend, the middle managed, the mid-size portfolio guy, he needs to hear it from his customers that they care, they need this.
Did you also address the question of some companies that are pinkwashing their diversity initiatives, and they're saying, oh, we're investing in women, we're investing in companies that serve women. Women are half the world, so that's not a big deal. Or small companies where the husband is really running the business, but he makes his wife like the president and says it's a women.
His wife on it. Yeah. Carla, that's a great question. And I see you also asked in the chat about equal pay, and those are really important issues. And, as a scientist and a person who had their career in healthcare, I am so much in the weeds with data, and you get what you measure, right? And so while I think any steps in this direction are going to be beneficial, ultimately, we have to make sure that what we think we're investing in is actually what we're investing in. So having women in leadership as name only is not sufficient. Having lots of women at a company, but you're paying them 85% or 70% of what their male peers are making is not sufficient. And it goes on and on and on. So you're spot on that we need to all be aware of what we're getting in products that we think we're buying, and how we measure it is ultimately the where the magic is. So thank you for bringing that up.
So this is Lori. Fantastic presentation. Thank you. I think there's great awareness that we even need to stress that it's not just adding women taking care of women, but everyone taking care of women. That you can't say we're all male or we're all female, that the top success comes when we all work together, and that diversity is more than gender, it's perspective, it's experience, it's knowledge, it's passions. And I'm happy to share that WAFA is open to all genders and folks that are alumni and not alumni, because we are committed to helping women succeed, either as founders, funders, friends, that we all play a role in the success. And so thank you for being a great Penn alumna and helping us to bring your issues, your success, your insights out so everyone can see and be enhanced.
Well, and Lori, I believe that the Wharton bookstore is going to carry the book. So you can, our first commitment from a university bookstore was, I believe, Wharton. I don't want to, if you go in and ask for it, then you can definitely reinforce that consumer pressure. Thank you. We're going to be at the, one of our few in-person events is Patience and I are going to be at the Free Library on July 20th in their author series, which is particularly meaningful to me because I've had a long relationship with the Free Library. My mother was on their community advisory board too. So if any of you are in the Philadelphia area, and you can join us on July 20th for in-person, we'll be signing.
Have you reached out to Adam Grant at all for his authors at Wharton series?
No. If you'd like to make an introduction.
I will certainly see what we can do to help.
Okay. And Carol can give you my email address.
Thank you.
And I think that Ashley popped into the chat the information about the Free Library event. Tell your friends, we have to fill all those seats and there's almost 400 of them.
Ruth, I want to thank you for your presentation. And also there was a point on your call to action slide that I just attended a panel discussion about diverse hiring. And it was some things I hadn't thought about, but that some companies are starting to implement, which is about taking off certain requirements from a job description that are actually not required of the job. So for example, you must have 10 years of experience in such and such industry. Okay, but do you really need it to be in that industry? Or what if it was just 10 years of experience in a similar job, but people can learn about the industry on the job? Or just trying to think about things that have always been listed on job postings, because sometimes, to your point, a woman might see that and say, well, I have only 8 years of experience, or, oh, I was in healthcare and this is a pharma, this pharma is more of a med device, so it's more of technology, and they might say, I don't qualify. Or especially certain industries where they do have issues getting diverse candidates, not just women, but also, people of color, et cetera. If they don't look at what's on those job postings, or if they don't think about what's actually a requirement versus something that can be learned by a very high performing person, I think that that's a missed opportunity. And that panel was really talking about how they were three, hiring managers at different types of companies, and they were talking about how they completely shook it up and took all those things off of there. I mean, it's kind of akin to when companies would say, must be able to lift 50 pounds. And it was like, that's the receptionist. Why does the receptionist, or why does the person who's the paralegal, why does the paralegal have to lift 50 pounds? Those types of things. I think that we just need to look at all of the things that are taken as givens and challenge them, because unless we challenge those things, is going to be self-perpetuating. And it might not be the case in every industry, right? If there's, a doctor has to have certain qualifications, right? But I think we just need to.
No, you're so right. And not only in hiring, that we have to break down some of these really systemic assumptions about what we need to do work, but where it also shows up is in due diligence for investors. And we've been working with some other folks in this space around, we're calling it due diligence 2.0. And remember back to my story in Singapore, where the women entrepreneurs and managers were just complaining and whining and crying about how there's this double standard, and they couldn't get the money because they didn't have enough assets under management, so they couldn't get any more money, and all these. Ultimately, when we're evaluating investments, think about the due diligence questions that, needing to have a track record, for instance, needing to have a certain amount of money already under management. That why, just like what you're saying in terms of, does that person really need to lift 50 pounds? No, they're a receptionist. So we need to get out of some of our routines and assumptions at every point that we make decisions about how we use capital. So that's a really good point.
Yes, I agree with that, because, the media industry does a good thing on that. I think the investment industry should kind of follow suit. A lot of the majors, Netflix, Amazon, Google, they hire based off potential. In fact, some requirements, they've even taken off college degree. If you have a high school diploma and you have 20 years experience and you can code or you can create what they need you to create, you have the talent that they need, and they'll hire you. So they've shifted their mindset. And a lot of executives, if you have that position where you can change policy, make sure that you look at those that have the potential. Hire based off potential instead of experience, and I think you'll get a better result. And I'll tell you why. Because that person is hungry to learn. Where a person with experience, heavy experience, they can be on a consultant level, but to be in the groundwork in the weeds, they're not going to be open to. I don't want to offend anybody on the call with a lot of experience. This is how the trend is going, that media companies are hiring positions of potential, off of what they know, their talent, and it's done very well.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between hiring and setting up your structure to hire to comply with guidance or direction that says you must do this, right? And hiring because you believe that you're going to get a better result if you do this. So the trick is to change the mindset of those hiring to believe that they're going to get a better job set. Then all these things will go away about the artificial restrictions and all that kind of stuff. They'll all go away naturally. But that's the challenge, I think, is to take the data that you're finding and the experience of people who have done well and make sure that that's promulgated to the people so that people can learn. And I think over time they'll evolve to that position as long as they understand that they're going to do better if they hire this way.
Well, I really appreciate your enthusiasm and attention, and so grateful for your thoughts. And Carol, when we brainstormed having an event like this, you promised that you would deliver people who were really interesting and engaged, and you certainly did. So thank you all. It's a really great opportunity.
Ruth, it's been a pleasure. This has been wonderful. And, you and I have spent a lot of time together talking about these issues. And, just in this last hour plus, I've learned more. So this was, yes, I very much appreciate it. And I think, I don't remember if you had mentioned what the original title of your book was going to be.
Oh. Right. So for a long time, the book was called More Pie. And and we didn't talk as much about the impact on overall, the economy, and the notion that diversity actually grows the economic pie rather than limiting it. And Milton Friedman's famous quote, which suddenly escapes me, that will come to me in
I
a
forget
minute.
too.
But here, it's in my book. I will read it to you in a moment. But
Yes.
that we, and we had great editors who helped us think about what we were really selling with the book, and that we wanted people to show up who are interested in the investment opportunities, not so much as the social and economic growth opportunity.
Right.
And so here it is, Milton Friedman, 1980. Most economic fallacies derive from the tendency to assume that there is a fixed pie that one party can gain only at the expense of another. And that, as we know, is not true. And while I didn't agree with all of Milton's, Uncle Milty's policies, my mother was an economist and would often rail against him. I think that he's spot on with that quote. But more pie, no longer the title.
No. But
the book's available now.
Yeah.
Linda, the book's available now. You can order them from Simon & Schuster, Barnes & Noble, or Amazon, or if you want to buy a whole bunch, you can go to bulkbooks.com and get them for a lot less money. And as I said, all proceeds go to Tara Health Foundation and the Women of the World Endowment.
It's excellent. And it's such an important message. I mean, and I do emphasize when I talk about it, that this isn't a zero-sum game. It's not a replacement strategy to have more women and then take men out of the equation. And I think that the reason it's important is, I think Lori was alluding to this earlier, is that, there's this threat that you're taking away jobs from men, that there's a loss there. And I think it's important to just continue to emphasize that it's about inclusion and growing the economic pie. So
yeah, and
thank you.
It really permeates all areas of society, because I was just hearing a story about Title IX, and some of the blowback on Title IX is that if we're investing more in women in athletics, then we're taking it away from the men, which is just such a bad way of thinking about it.
Yeah. So and as Ruth mentioned, I wanted to just remind everybody about the event at the Free Library of Philadelphia. And it looks exciting because we've got, the former long-term anchor of WCAU NBC 10 News, Renee Chenault, is going to be facilitating that discussion. So I think it's going to be a fabulous event, July 20th.
Right. Thanks, Carol.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And I think you put my email in the chat. Yeah, thanks, Pat.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to continue this conversation with anybody if you'd like to reach out.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.